The Gyra system was dark in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of light, and everything to do with the absence of hope. And at its center, the dead star sat like a wound in space, wrapped in a sphere of living tissue that pulsed with the thoughts of something that had eaten 1,000 worlds and was still hungry. Task Force Anvil gathered at the edge of the system, 11 ships that had once been 19, battered and scarred and running on fumes and stubbornness, and they looked at what was waiting for them, and nobody said anything for a while. The Tide's defensive swarm filled the space around the coordination node like a living storm, hundreds of thousands of bioships circling in patterns that shifted and flowed and adapted to everything. And behind them, the node itself was a moon of flesh and thought, the brain that controlled every Tide organism in the galaxy, and it was alive in a way that made the scanners scream. Rhea stood on the bridge of the Elbow of Fate and looked at her crew, and they looked back at her. And there was fear in that room because they were human, and humans are always afraid. But there was something else too, something that had no name in any language, but that every human recognized, the quiet, stubborn thing that lives in the chest of every person who has ever looked at something impossible and said, "Well, here we go." "Mitch," Rhea said, "is the cargo bay loaded?" "Every mining charge, demolition explosive, improvised warhead, and repurposed industrial detonator we have is packed into the cargo bays, Captain. And I would like to note for the record that we are currently carrying enough explosive force to crack a small planet, and I am choosing to feel very calm about this." "Afia, you have the course plotted?" "Straight through the middle," Afia said, and her hands were steady on the controls, even though her voice was not. "Gregor, weapons, such as they are," Gregor said, cracked his metal knuckles. "Dolores, engines are ready," Dolores said from engineering, "and by ready I mean they are running, and I have asked them very nicely not to stop." Rhea opened a channel to the rest of Task Force Anvil, the 6 remaining compact ships and the 3 remaining human ships. And she said, "We need a path. I need you to punch a hole through that swarm and keep it open long enough for us to get through. And I am not going to pretend that is not a lot to ask." Captain Singh on the lunch break said, "See you on the other side, Vasquez." And Captain Odell, on the hard bargain, said, "Give them hell, Rhea." And Captain Park on the Penny Dreadful said, "I just want everyone to know that from a scientific perspective, this is absolutely fascinating." And the compact captains said things in their own languages that the translators rendered as variations of, "It has been an honor." Task Force Anvil charged. The remaining ships hit the Tide swarm like a fist hitting a wall, and the wall cracked. Not much, not for long, but enough. And the ships peeled off in pairs to hold the gap open, fighting with everything they had left, burning through ammunition and power reserves and hull integrity. And one by one they fell, but the gap stayed open, because every time a ship died, another one moved to fill the space it left. The lunch break lasted 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, Captain Singh rammed 3 bioships and was chewing gum the entire time. And the hard bargain lasted 8 minutes, and Captain Odell was talking to his ship until the end, saying, "Come on, girl, you can do it, just a little more." And the Penny Dreadful lasted 14 minutes, because Captain Park had figured out a way to use the science vessel's scanning array as a weapon, and she was laughing when the ship finally broke apart. The Elbow of Fate flew through the gap they had made. The swarm closed in behind them, and bioships latched onto them. Hull from every direction, clawing and biting and burning through the metal. And the crew fought them, the way miners fight a cave-in, with tools and torches and bare hands, when there was nothing else. On Deck 4, a group of engineers held a corridor against tide-boarding organisms, using welding torches and a cargo loader that Dolores drove like a battering ram, smashing through things that had no right to exist on a ship. And on Deck 7, Gregor and his demolitions team blew sections of their own hull to vent tide organisms into space, sealing the gaps behind them with emergency patches that would hold for minutes at most. Mitch kept the ship on course through it all, calculating and recalculating, and adjusting for the damage that was tearing the ship apart around him. And his voice on the intercom was steady and dry, and exactly what the crew needed to hear. Hull integrity at 41%, he said. Also 38%. Also, I am now going to stop updating, because the numbers are making me sad. We are 2 minutes from the target. Please keep all limbs inside the vehicle. A tide organism punched through the bridge ceiling, and Rhea shot it with a mining pistol, and it fell, and she kicked it aside and sat back down in her chair. 1 minute, Afia said, and the coordination node filled the viewport now, a wall of living flesh that pulsed with alien thought, and the bioships were everywhere, tearing the elbow apart deck by deck. Hull integrity at 12%, Mitch said. Reactor containment is nominalish. I want to say it has been a pleasure, but honestly, this has been very stressful. However, I would not have wanted to be any other ship's AI, and I mean that. 30 seconds, Afia said. Rhea hit the intercom one last time, and said, all hands, get to the escape pods if you can. That is not an order, that is a request, and I will not think less of anyone who goes. The pods launched into the chaos outside, and some of them survived, and some did not. But most of the crew did not go to the pods. They stayed at their stations, because they were going to finish this job the way they had finished every job. Together. The elbow of fate hit the coordination node. The ship crashed through the outer membrane of the biostructure like a fist through wet paper. Plunging into the interior were vast caverns of living tissue pulsed with light and thought and hunger. And the ship was breaking apart now, coming to pieces around them. But it was inside. It was where it needed to be. Rhea sat in her chair, and the bridge was falling apart, and the stars were gone, replaced by the glow of alien flesh. And Mitch said, we are in position, Captain. Detonation is ready on your command. Do you have any last words? Rhea thought about Earth, and about the stars, and about the people she had known, and the people she would never know. Clerk who had accidentally named a cargo ship the Elbow of Fate, and she smiled and said, log it as a successful delivery. Logging, Mitch said. It has been an honor, Captain. You too, Mitch. The detonation was visible across 3 star systems. A flash of light so bright that sensors across the compact registered it as a new star being born. And at the center of that light, the coordination node came apart in a storm of fire that tore through the Gyra system like the fist of something older than the stars themselves. And across the galaxy, in every system where the devouring tide had spread its hunger, something changed. Bioships that had been moving with coordinated purpose suddenly stopped, shuddering as the signal that guided them went silent, and then they began to drift, turning on each other, breaking apart, going dormant, falling like puppets whose strings had been cut. And on 100 worlds where the tide had been advancing its front lines collapsed into chaos, and the defenders who had been losing for 11 years suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that had forgotten how to fight. The war was not over in that moment, but the war was decided in that moment. Admiral Sorvan stood on the bridge of a compact cruiser that had arrived with the reinforcement fleet, too late to help, but not too late to see, and he stood at the viewport and watched the light fade in the Gyra system, and he said nothing for a very long time. When he finally spoke, he said, designate the Gyra system as a memorial zone. No vessel is to disturb it, ever. The war ended over the following months, as the tide disintegrated, system by system, and the compact that had been dying for 11 years found itself alive in a way that none of them had expected, and they owed that life to a species they had called toddlers, a species that had sent them a cargo ship. Humanity was never called a fringe species. The memorial at Gyra was built by all 12 species of the compact working together, a vast structure of crystal and light that orbited the dead star where the coordination node had been. And at its center, they placed a piece of salvaged hull from the Elbow of Fate, a twisted scrap of mismatched metal, still bearing scorch marks and weld scars and the faded remains of a hand-painted sign that someone had put up as a joke, and that now made every being who read it stand in silence. The sign read, "0 days since last workplace accident." Sorvon wrote the official compact military history of the war, all 12 volumes of it, and he spent 3 years on it because he wanted to get it right. And on the last page of the last volume, he wrote the final words himself. They were not warriors, they were not conquerors, they were not the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced species the galaxy had ever seen. They were workers, they were builders, they were the people who showed up with the wrong tools and made them work anyway. They were the people who looked at the impossible and said, "Well, here we go." They were human, and they finished the job. In shipyards and military academies across the compact, a new doctrine was taught alongside the old, not as a replacement, but as a companion. The elegant and the ugly, side by side. And the instructors who taught it never gave it a formal name, because formal names were not really the point. They just called it the human way. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, in the place where the elbow of fate had made its last delivery, the light of the detonation was still traveling outward, a wave of brightness moving through the galaxy at the speed of light. And it would travel for millions of years, touching stars that had not yet been born, and every civilization that ever saw it and asked what made that light would hear the same story. A cargo ship, a tired crew, a job that needed doing, and the stubborn human refusal to stop until the work was done. That was the elbow of fate. That was humanity. And the galaxy never forgot it. The compact shipyard station, called Ethel's Grace, was a city in space, a vast spinning ring of docks and repair bays and living quarters, where the Ninth Fleet had come to lick its wounds. And in the largest repair bay on the station, the elbow of fate sat like a wounded animal, surrounded by aliens who could not believe it was still alive. A team of Arathi engineers walked through the ship's corridors, with their bioluminescent skin flickering in shades of deep orange, which was the Arathi color for confusion and horror mixed together. And the lead engineer, whose name was Vaisha, stopped in front of a section of hull that had been patched with what appeared to be a cargo container lid welded over a blast hole with mining rivets and then reinforced with what she could only describe as metal straps and hope. "This is not engineering," she said to Dolores Cotto, who was walking beside her with a coffee cup in one hand and a wrench in the other. It kept the air in. "That is not the standard for structural integrity. It is when someone is shooting at you." Vaisha stared at the patch for a long time, and then said, "This is an engineering war crime." Dolores shrugged and said, "It worked, though." Vaisha had no answer for that, because it had worked, in fact. Word about the elbow of fate had spread across the compact, like a disease, and every day more aliens came to look at it, walking through its corridors and staring at the improvised modifications, with expressions that ranged from fascination to physical pain. The human crew treated them all like tourists at a factory, showing them around and explaining things in a way that made the aliens more confused rather than less. Gregor Tomlin showed a group of Kethri weapons officers the mining charges they had used as mines. One of the officers asked, "These are not military ordnance," and Gregor said, "No, they are for blowing up asteroids," and the officer said, "Used asteroid explosives against bioships," and Gregor held up his metal fingers and said, "I use whatever is in the toolbox." The crew held a barbecue in the cargo bay using a plasma torch as a grill, and half the station showed up to watch because none of the alien species had ever seen anyone cook meat with a tool designed for cutting through starship hulls. And Afia Mensa played music on a portable speaker, and some of the younger compact crew members started moving to the rhythm in ways that their bodies were not designed for, which the humans found delightful. Rhea was not at the barbecue, because Rhea had been summoned before the Compact War Council. The War Council met in a chamber at the heart of Ethel's Grace that was designed to be impressive, with soaring ceilings and floating light sculptures and seats arranged in a semicircle for the representatives of all 12 compact species. And Rhea walked in wearing her work coveralls because she did not own a dress uniform, because humanity did not have dress uniforms, because humanity had not expected to need them. The council expected her to apologize for disobeying Admiral Sorvan's direct order at Vedra, and Rhea did not apologize. "Your doctrine does not work against the tide," she said, standing in the center of the chamber with her hands at her sides and her voice level and calm. "And I say that with respect for the people who wrote it, because it is smart and it is elegant. And in any other war, it would be enough. But the tide adapts too fast for elegant. The tide changes faster than your rule books allow you to change. And if you keep fighting by the book, you will keep losing." A Kethri counselor leaned forward and said, "And what do you propose instead?" "Stop being predictable," Rhea said. "The tide reads patterns the way a predator reads the movements of prey. It learns your formations and your timing and your responses, and it builds counters to all of them. Having formations and timing and responses. Stop being clean. Stop being organized. Be messy. Be ugly. Be the thing it cannot predict because you cannot predict it yourself." "You are describing chaos," the counselor said. "I am describing humans," Rhea said. The chamber erupted into argument, and it went on for a long time, with factions forming and dissolving and reforming, and the loudest voices were the ones who wanted Rhea court-martialed and the elbow of fate sent home. But there was one voice that was quiet, and that quietness was more powerful than all the shouting. Grandmother Ulth of the Maleth was the oldest living strategist in the compact, a small creature that looked like a tortoise made of crystal, with eyes that held 400 years of watching wars be won and lost. And when she finally spoke, the chamber went silent, because when Grandmother Ulth spoke, you listened, or you were a fool. "I have watched 11 years of this war." Voice like wind through glass. "And I have watched us lose it beautifully, with perfect doctrine and perfect ships and perfect formations. We have lost beautifully. And now I have watched one ugly human ship win a battle by being everything we are not. And I think perhaps it is time we stopped being beautiful and started being alive." The opposition sputtered, but Grandmother Ulth had made her decision, and in the compact, her word carried weight that no vote could overturn. Meanwhile, in a quiet corridor of the station, Rhea found Admiral Sorvan standing alone and staring out a viewport at the stars, and she stood beside him and said nothing for a while, because sometimes silence was more honest than words. "I had a reason for my doctrine," Sorvan said finally, and his voice was different from the cold, sharp tone she had heard in battle. It was tired and old and heavy with something he had been carrying for a long time. "The Kethri homeworld," he said, "fell 9 years ago. A commander in our defense fleet improvised, abandoned doctrine, tried something clever, and it failed. And the tide broke through and ate our world, and I watched it happen from the bridge of this ship. And I swore that I would never allow deviation from doctrine again, because doctrine is safe, and doctrine is predictable, and doctrine does not gamble with the lives of billions." Rhea was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I am sorry about your world." "I do not need your sympathy, Captain. You have it anyway," she said. "And I will not tell you that improvising always works, because it does not. Sometimes it fails, and people die. But doing the same thing that is already failing will also kill people, and at least my way has a chance of being the thing the enemy did not expect." Sorvan looked at her with his stone-carved face and his forearms folded across his chest, and said nothing. But something shifted behind his eyes, something small and grudging and real. Back on the elbow of fate, Mitch had been running calculations for weeks, quietly processing every piece of data from every engagement with the tide that the compact had recorded. And he called Rhea to the bridge and displayed a pattern on the main screen. The tide is not just a swarm, he said. It has a coordination node, a central intelligence, something that tells all the bioships what to do and when to adapt. And I believe I know roughly where it is, deep inside consumed territory in a system called Gyra. And as you destroy it, the whole tide falls apart. Rhea stared at the screen and said, "How sure are you?" 87%, which for a mining AI doing xenobiology is honestly pretty impressive, and I would like some credit for that. Grandmother Alt's decision came down the next day, and it changed everything. The Elbow of Fate was designated the flagship of a new experimental unit called Task Force Anvil. Ships and compact volunteers who were willing to throw away the rulebook and fight the way humans fought, dirty and ugly and unpredictable. And their mission was to go deep behind tide lines and find the brain and kill it. And Admiral Sorvon, who had spent 9 years clinging to doctrine like a drowning man clinging to a rope, walked onto the Elbow of Fate and said to Rhea, "I am coming with you." Rhea looked at him and said, "It is going to be messy." "I am beginning to understand," Sorvon said, "that messy is not the same as wrong." Dolores handed him a coffee cup, and Gregor showed him where the good seats were, and Mitch said, "Welcome aboard, Admiral. Please note that the third step on the ladder to Deck 2 is loose, and I have been asking someone to fix it for 8 months. And the crew of the Elbow of Fate laughed, because laughing was how they got ready for the impossible. And the impossible was exactly where they were going. Task Force Anvil left compact space on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, they were in hell. The fleet was not much to look at, and that was the point, because if the compact had sent a beautiful fleet, the tide would have seen it coming and crushed it. But nobody sees a handful of ugly ships sneaking through the dark. And so Task Force Anvil was built from the kind of ships that nobody looked at twice. The Elbow of Fate led the way, and behind it came 3 more human ships. The Lunch Break, which was a converted ore hauler captained by a woman named Singh who chewed gum during combat. The Hard Bargain, which was a refitted deep space tug captained by a retired merchant marine named Odell, who talked to his ship like it was a horse. And the Penny Dreadful, which was a science vessel with guns bolted to it, captained by a xenobiologist named Park, who had volunteered because she wanted to study the tide up close, and the rest of the crew thought she was insane. Behind the human ships came 12 compact vessels, crewed by aliens who had watched the Elbow of Fate hold the Vedra corridor, and had decided that maybe the human way of doing things was worth trying. And they had modified their ships with unauthorized patches and improvised weapons, and one of them had even welded a cup holder to their command console in honor of the humans. Sorvon stood on the bridge of the Elbow of Fate and watched the stars disappear as they crossed the border into tide-consumed space. And what they found on the other side was the worst thing any of them had ever seen. The tide did not just conquer worlds, it ate them, and the star systems they passed through were graveyards of a kind that had no name. Planets stripped down to their cores, their surfaces converted into biomass that pulsed with a slow, terrible rhythm like the breathing of something vast and sleeping. And the stars themselves were dimmed by organic structures that wrapped around them like webs, feeding on their light, and everywhere there was silence, the deep, horrible silence of places where everything that had once lived had been consumed. The alien crews struggled with it, because many of them came from species whose homeworlds were somewhere behind them in the dark, already eaten, and the reality of what the tide had done hit them in a way that battle reports never could, and there was grief on those ships that had no words in any language. The humans struggled with it too, but the humans coped the way humans always coped. On the Elbow of Fate, Dolores organized a poker tournament in the engine room, and the buy-in was dessert rations. And Gregor taught 3 Orathi crew members how to arm wrestle, which was complicated because Orathi had different numbers of joints in their arms, but they figured it out. And Afia put together a playlist of old Earth music that she played on the bridge speakers, and Mitch complained about every single song, but never asked her to turn it off. Sorvan watched all of this and did not understand it. He found Rhea in the cargo bay one night when she could not sleep, sitting on a crate with a cup of coffee and staring at a viewport that showed nothing but the dark, and he sat down beside her, which was something he would not have done a month ago. "How do your people do this?" he asked, and his voice was quiet and honest in a way that it never was on the bridge. "Do what?" Rhea said. "Function," he said. "We have been traveling through consumed space for 6 days. Every system we pass is a graveyard. The probability of our survival decreases with every hour. And your crew is playing cards and cooking food and singing. How is this possible?" Rhea was quiet for a while, and then she said, "We do not function." "I have watched you function, Captain." "No," she said. "You have watched us keep going. That is not the same thing. Every person on this ship is scared. Every person on this ship has looked out that viewport and felt something they cannot name. And then they go play cards or cook food or sing, because the alternative is to sit in the dark and think about it. And sitting in the dark does not fix anything. So we keep going. Not because we are brave, not because we are strong, but because stopping has never been an option we know how to choose." Sorvan was quiet for a long time after that. The first battle came on day 8, when a Tide patrol swarm found them in the ruins of a star system that had once held 6 inhabited worlds, and now held nothing but biomass and hunger. And Task Force Anvil fought the way humans fight, messy and loud and unpredictable, with mining charges and improvised tactics, and Captain Singh ramming the lunch break into a bioship twice its size while chewing gum and saying, "Hold on, everybody," like she was merging into traffic. They won, but they lost 2 compact ships and 17 people, and Rhea held a funeral in the cargo bay that night, with the whole crew standing in a circle, and each person saying one thing about the people they had lost. And then they went back to work, because there was always more work. The second battle was worse, and the third was worse than that. And by the time they had fought their way to the edge of the Gyra system, they had lost 5 ships and 41 people. And the Elbow of Fate had so many patches on its hull that Mitch said, "I believe we have now reached the philosophical point where the patches are the ship and the ship is the patches." But Mitch had done what Mitch always did, quietly and without credit. And he had analyzed every encounter, and every scan, and every piece of data. And he had found it. "The coordination node is there," he said, displaying the Gyra system on the main screen. And at the center of the system was a dead star, surrounded by a structure so massive it defied comprehension. A sphere of living tissue, the Zanga, size of a small moon, wrapped around the corpse of a sun, pulsing with signals that reached every Tide bioship in the galaxy, and it was protected by the densest concentration of Tide forces anyone had ever seen. "How many ships are guarding it?" Rhea asked. "Conservatively," Mitch said, "several 100,000. And we have 11 ships, Captain, and to be fair, several of those are held together primarily by stubbornness." Rhea stood on the bridge and looked at the screen, and she thought about the 41 people they had already lost, and the billions the Tide had consumed, and the families back on Earth, and the homeworlds that would never exist again, and she made a decision that was not brave and not heroic, but was simply the only decision left. "We are going to fly this ship into that thing," she said. "We are going to load every explosive we have into the cargo bays, and we are going to fly straight into the coordination node, and we are going to blow it up from the inside." The bridge was silent, and then Gregor said, "That is a one-way trip." "Yes," Rhea said. "Well," Gregor said, flexing his metal fingers, I was not doing anything tomorrow anyway. Rhea called a vote, because she would not order people to die, and the crew voted, and it was unanimous, and not because they were not afraid, but because they were the kind of people who would always finish the job, no matter what the job cost. Sorvon stood at the back of the bridge and watched 47 humans vote to die, and something inside him that had been frozen for 9 years since he watched his homeworld burn finally cracked open, and he went to the communications console and opened a channel that reached all the way back to compact space. "This is Admiral Sorvon of the Kethri, assigned to Task Force Anvil," he said, and his voice shook, which had never happened before. "I am transmitting coordinates for the Devouring Tides coordination node. In the Gira system, the human ship Elbow of Fate intends to destroy it through direct assault. They will not survive. I am requesting any available fleet elements to converge on these coordinates, not to save them, because I do not believe they can be saved, but because what they are about to do should be witnessed." He closed the channel and looked at Rhea, and Rhea looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say. The Vedra corridor was a narrow lane of navigable space squeezed between two neutron stars that pulsed with enough radiation to fry any ship that drifted outside the safe channel, and it was the only way into the inner systems of the Compact's eastern territories, and the devouring tide was coming through it with 10,000 bioships. Rhea stood on the bridge of the Elbow of Fate and watched the tactical display as the swarm appeared at the far end of the corridor, like a stain spreading across clean water. And each bioship was a living thing the size of a destroyer, covered in armor that grew back when you shot it, armed with tendrils that could punch through hull plating, and driven by a hunger that had no off switch. "Mitch, how many is that?" she asked. "Approximately 10,000, Captain, give or take a few hundred that I am choosing not to count, because honestly, what difference does it make at this point?" Admiral Sorvon deployed the 9th Fleet in perfect formation, 3 layered lines of warships with overlapping shield arcs and coordinated firing solutions. And it was beautiful, the way a chess game played by a master is beautiful. Every piece in the right place, every angle covered, every response planned. The first volley of energy lances hit the swarm, and hundreds of bioships burst apart in flashes of green fire. And the Compact officers nodded to each other, because this was how war was supposed to work. Then the tide adapted. It took them 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes the swarm shifted from a mass charge into a dispersal pattern that flowed like water around the energy lance volleys, spreading thin where the fire was heavy and surging thick where it was light. And suddenly the perfect formation was shooting at empty space, while bioships poured through the gaps. The first Compact ship died screaming on every frequency, as tide organisms latched onto its hull and began eating through it. Then the second ship died, and then the third, and Sorvon's perfect formation started to crack. Rhea watched from the rear logistics position, where she had been told to stay, and her hands tightened on the arms of her chair. "They are not adjusting," she said. "Compact doctrine does not allow for significant tactical deviation during active engagement," Mitch said, and then added, "which seems like something you might want to reconsider when the enemy can change its entire strategy in 4 minutes. But what do I know? I am a mining AI." Rhea opened a channel to the flagship. "Admiral Sorvon, this is Captain Vasquez of the Elbow of Fate. I have a proposal." There was a pause that lasted long enough for another Compact ship to die, and then Sorvon's voice came through cold and sharp. "You are a logistics vessel, Captain. You have no role in this engagement." "Sir, the corridor narrows to about 3 kilometers at grid reference 77. Plug that gap with a physical barrier. The swarm cannot flow around it. They will have to come through it, and if they have to come through it, you can concentrate fire on a single point. You are suggesting we place a ship as a blockade." I am suggesting we place my ship as a blockade. Your cargo ship. Yes, sir. That is tactically absurd, and I will not authorize it. Understood, Admiral. Rhea closed the channel and sat in her chair for exactly 3 seconds, while 2 more compact ships died on the tactical display, and then she said, Athia, take us to grid 77, full speed. Athia Mensa did not hesitate, because she had been flying broken ships her whole life, and one more insane order was just another Tuesday. And the elbow of fate surged forward with its mismatched thrusters roaring, and its hull groaning in protest. All hands, Rhea said over the intercom. We are about to do something stupid. Get ready. Elbow of fate did not panic, because they were miners and haulers and engineers, and they had been doing stupid things in dangerous places since before any of them could remember. And they moved with the speed and efficiency of people who had spent their lives working under pressure. Dolores Cato and her engineering team welded blast plating over every exposed surface they could reach, pulling sheets of cargo armor off the walls and bolting them to the hull with mining rivets. And Gregor Tomlin opened the weapons locker, which was really just a storage bay full of mining charges and demolition explosives, and began setting up the ugliest minefield anyone had ever seen, dumping thousands of tons of high-yield charges into the corridor ahead of the ship. The elbow of fate reached grid 77, and Athia spun the ship sideways and slammed it into position across the narrowest point of the corridor, like a cork in a bottle, and the cargo crane arms extended outward like braces against the walls of navigable space, anchoring the ship in place. The tide swarm hit them like a wave hitting a rock. The first impact shook the entire ship and threw people off their feet, and Mitch said, Hull breach on deck 4, also deck 5, also deck 7. I'm going to stop listing them individually and just say, we have a lot of hull breaches. And the crew got up and went to work. They patched holes with cargo containers, welding them into the gaps in the hull, while bioships clawed at the metal outside. And miners in EVA suits went out onto the hull, in zero gravity under fire, with welding torches and plasma cutters, and they sealed breaches and cut away tide organisms that were trying to burrow through, working in the void like it was just another day on an asteroid. The mining charges detonated in chains as bioships hit them, filling the corridor with fire and shrapnel, and every ship that made it through the minefield had to come straight at the elbow of fate, and the ship's improvised weapons array, which was really just mining lasers bolted to cargo mounts, cut them apart at point-blank range. Mitch played an old work shanty over the intercom, and the crew sang along while they fought, because that was what humans did. They worked, and they sang, and they refused to stop. On the bridge of his crystal warship, Admiral Sorvan watched the tactical display and saw a single ugly cargo ship holding the entire devouring tide at bay in the narrowest point of the corridor. And for the first time in his military career, he did not know what to say. His aide said, Admiral, the swarm is bunching up at the blockade point. If we concentrate fire now. Sorvan gave the order, and the Ninth Fleet reformed and fired everything it had into the massive bioships that were piling up against the elbow of fate, like water against a dam. And the concentrated fire tore through them by the hundreds and then by the thousands. Hours, and when it was over, the corridor was filled with the burning remains of the swarm. And the elbow of fate was still there, battered and broken, and leaking atmosphere from a dozen places, with half its hull plating gone, and one of its cargo crane arms bent at an angle that made Mitch say, I am not even going to calculate the repair cost, because I do not want to cry. But it was still there. Rhea sat in her chair with blood running down her face from a cut on her forehead, and said, Mitch, damage report. We are, and I want to be very clear about this, an absolute mess, but we are a flying absolute mess, which I think counts as a victory. The Ninth Fleet had won the Battle of the Vedra Corridor, and the cost had been 31 compact warships destroyed, and one human cargo freighter that by every law of physics and engineering should have been destroyed 10 times over, but simply was not, because its crew had refused to let it die. Admiral Sorvan opened a channel to the elbow of fate and said, "Captain Vasquez, you disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir," Rhea said. There was a long silence. "We will discuss this," he said, and closed the channel. But across the Ninth Fleet, and then across the entire compact communication network, the story spread like fire. The story of the ugly human cargo ship that had plugged a corridor and held back 10,000 Tide bioships, with mining charges, and welding torches, and old songs, and the question that followed the story was always the same. What exactly are these humans? The war had been going on for 11 years before anyone bothered to tell humanity about it. Somewhere out in the dark between galaxies, a thing called the devouring tide had been eating star systems one by one, swallowing planets whole and turning everything it touched into more of itself. And the 12 species of the Valori Compact had been fighting it with everything they had, and they were losing. Ambassador Thiodan of the Orathi stood 7 feet tall with skin that glowed soft blue when he was calm and burned white when he was angry. And right now, he was burning so bright the humans in the room had to squint as he stared out the viewport of Prometheus Ring, humanity's largest orbital station above Earth, at the collection of ships docked outside. "These are your vessels," he said, and it was not a question. Admiral Chen Wei of the United Stellar Command stood beside him with his hands behind his back, and his face perfectly still, and said, "Yes, that one appears to be leaking. We are aware." Thiodan had come to Earth with a simple demand, because the Compact needed every species it could get, even the ones that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 40 years ago, even the ones the rest of the galaxy called the loud neighbors or the short-lived ones, or most commonly, the galactic toddlers, and humanity had agreed to help, because when someone tells you a swarm of alien locusts is eating the galaxy, you tend to say yes. But nobody had expected this. The Compact wanted warships, and humanity did not have warships, because humanity had spent its 40 years of FTL travel doing what humans always did, which was mining, and hauling, and building and selling, and arguing about trade routes. And so what the Compact got instead was a fleet of cargo haulers and mining barges, and one research vessel that had a very nice coffee machine. Thiodan's glow went from white to a shade that the Orathi reserved for deep personal shame on behalf of others. The ship they chose as the flagship was the worst of them all. The UCS Elbow of Fate sat in dry dock like something a child had built out of scrap metal and anger. And that was not far from the truth, because the ship had originally been a heavy cargo freighter called the Elbow Grease, before a registry clerk made a typo that nobody ever bothered to fix. And over the years the ship had been rebuilt and patched and welded and modified so many times that no 2 sections of its hull were the same color or even the same metal. Captain Rhea Vasquez stood on its bridge and looked at the console in front of her. And the console looked back at her, with 3 warning lights that had been blinking for so long that the crew had named them, and one of them was called Gerald. Rhea was 43 years old, with calloused hands and short dark hair, and a face that had been weathered by years of asteroid mining in the belt. And she had not asked to be a warship captain, because she was not a soldier, and had never been a soldier. But when the Stellar Command asked for volunteers, she had raised her hand, because someone had to, and she figured she had already survived enough mining accidents that an alien war could not be much worse. "Mitch," she said, "give me a status report." The ship's AI responded in a voice that sounded like a man who had been working overtime for 30 years and had stopped caring about anything except getting to the end of his shift. "Hull integrity is at what I would generously call 82%, Captain. And I want to emphasize the word generously, because I am being very kind to this ship right now. The port cargo crane has a stress fracture that I have been complaining about for 6 months. The starboard maneuvering thrusters pull to the left, which I have also been complaining about, and someone in engineering has welded a cup holder to the reactor housing, which I have decided to simply not think about. But she flies, Rhea said. She does technically fly, yes? Good enough. Rhea's crew was not what anyone would call military material, and she assembled them the way a foreman assembles a work crew, picking people who were tough and smart and stubborn, and who did not panic when things went wrong, because in mining things always went wrong. Her chief engineer was a woman named Dolores Cato, who had once kept a crippled mining station running for 3 weeks with nothing but welding wire and profanity. And her tactical officer was a forward demolitions expert named Gregor Tomlin, who had lost 2 fingers to a mining charge and had replaced them with metal ones that he claimed were an improvement. And her helmsman was a young pilot named Afia Mensa, who could fly anything with thrusters because she had learned on broken ships, and broken ships were all she knew. There were 47 of them in all. Them were soldiers, but all of them were the kind of people who had spent their lives fixing things that were broken in places that were trying to kill them. And they looked at the alien war and saw just another bad shift. The 9th Combined Fleet of the Valori Compact was waiting for them at the staging point beyond Jupiter. And when the elbow of fate limped into formation beside ships that gleamed like sculptures made of light, the silence on the compact communication channels was the loudest thing Rhea had ever heard. Admiral Sorvon of the Kethri commanded the 9th Fleet from the bridge of a warship so beautiful it looked like it had been carved from a single crystal. And Sorvon himself was 8 feet of rigid military perfection, with 4 arms and a face like carved stone, and eyes that missed nothing. And when he saw the elbow of fate take its position in his fleet, he stared at it for a very long time. "What," he said to his aide, "is that?" "Contribution, Admiral. It appears to be a cargo ship." "It is a cargo ship, Admiral." Sorvon was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Assign it to rear logistics, and keep it away from my battle line." Rhea received the order and said, "Copy that," and then turned to her crew and said, "All right, we've got time before the shooting starts, so let us get to work." And the crew of the Elbow of Fate got to work the way humans always got to work, with tools and sweat and ideas that nobody had asked for, and they began modifying their ship in ways that no military manual had ever described, and no compact engineer would ever approve. Welding and cutting and bolting and rigging through every shift, and Mitch played old work songs over the intercom, and complained about everything, and quietly made sure every modification was structurally sound. Nobody on the compact ships paid any attention to the ugly little cargo ship at the back of the fleet. That was going to be a mistake.